It's totally shocking. I mean, it's shocking because we've moved now from the demonization, calling you a bigot, to the law having become involved, and the law actually having been, I would say, misappropriated in very political ways in this fashion.
Claire Fox is a writer, broadcaster, and free speech campaigner. She used to be a panellist on Radio 4's The Moral Maze and appears regularly on Newsnight and Any Questions. She's also the founder and director of the Academy of Ideas, and she was elected Brexit Party MEP until the UK left the EU. I first came across Claire Fox from reading her book, I Find That Offensive. And since that time, she has been elevated to the House of Lords as Baroness Fox of Buckley, where she continues to be one of the most active contributors, raising awareness on issues around free speech and censorship. So, Claire Fox, thank you for joining me today.
It's a pleasure.
Tell me, what difference does it make to someone's life to be raised to the House of Lords, and how has it affected you?
Well, it makes a huge difference to me because I had maybe underestimated the amount of time I'd spend there. I think I thought that I'd be able to kind of wander in and make the odd speech and, wander out again.
Yeah.
Because I had really underestimated what lawmaking entailed. And I suddenly felt this huge sense of responsibility when I realized that I really was genuinely part of the legislative process, and that if I was following a law through, I had to take it seriously. And for somebody who's not from a legal background and had never really taken any interest in the actual dotting of the I's and crossing the T's of how a law is made, it was fairly overwhelming to discover that I had a lot of work to do in order to be able to make those contributions. So that has kind of transformed my life. So I now have got effectively two jobs because I run the Academy of Ideas, and then I suppose I'm what's known as a working peer. It's a choice. I don't need to do that. I mean, I'm not under any obligation to do it. But if you're there, what's the point otherwise?
Exactly.
The other thing is that I mean, it's incredibly intimidating place when you first arrive, and it wasn't socially a scene I was familiar with. I mean, I kind of spent a huge amount of time going, wow, what? Oh my God, the sense of history, and it's very beautiful place. But there are all sorts of rules and kind of aura around it, which I know that there are people from different backgrounds who it might not have been quite such a shock to, because if you went to a very fine public school, for example, you might have been familiar with those kind of surroundings, but I certainly am not. And I'm not alone, I'm not trying to make out I'm the kind of the pleb in the place and everybody else is posh. It's not like that, because that these days they're elevating all sorts of types. So there's quite a lot of us who would feel it socially slightly intimidated and inferior, a little bit, what am I doing here?
Yeah.
And it's meant to inspire a certain shock and awe, I think. I mean, you're meant to have those feelings. But I also have a sort of sense of historical tradition weighing very heavily on my shoulders. You feel there's a lot of parliamentarians who've been before me. And as I said, God, I'm from a far left background. I mean, Parliament, not my thing at all. And I just, I found it difficult to fit in, to learn the rules, even the way that you use language. But I suppose I've been there nearly 5 years now, and I'm picking it up slowly.
Well, you seem to be making a very active contribution. There are quite a few peers, from what I understand, who hardly turn up at all. But the contribution you're making is, as you say, the amount of time you put into it is what you determined for yourself, and you're obviously determined to put quite a lot in. Let me move on from the people who make the laws to the people who make the judgments on the laws, because quite recently the Supreme Court has come up with a ruling, certainly on the controversial issue of what is a woman. And they've defined a woman in terms of biological sex, and they've made that absolutely clear now. What's your view on that ruling?
Yeah, so I mean, it's something about the contemporary period is so peculiar that it's required the Supreme Court to clarify what to anybody was bleeding obvious, to be entirely frank. Biological sex isn't something I ever thought that I would have to spend the later part of my life explaining to anyone. I mean, how did we get here? And the Supreme Court decision, actually, all it was doing, to put it in its most modest position, even though it sent shockwaves, was to clarify that that's what the law always was.
Yeah.
It hasn't sort of suddenly pronounced in a sort of some pseudo-scientific body biological sex. It relates to what we might mean by single-sex provision in the Equality Act. That's what it was trying to clarify, because I couldn't and still can't get over the fact that a single-sex provision, until this Supreme Court had clarified it, was being interpreted by a wide range of public bodies and NGOs and quangos, and even the way that the law was written was being interpreted through a fog, which was that single sex could mean biological women, but it could also mean those people who declared that they were women or identified as women. And so you'd be having these arguments, or discussing a law where you'd be saying we must guarantee single sex provision, for example, in relation to domestic abuse charities or rape crisis centres. And this actually happened last year, involved in debates that I was in. And
Yeah.
I wish to clarify or ask the question in this debate, well, the problem is that this has been interpreted by these institutions to include men who identify as women. Can we make it clear that we mean biological sex? And the minister and all of the opposition ministers at the time just kept saying, it's single sex, that's clear. And I would say, no, it isn't clear, and so on and so forth. So the Supreme Court has been clear in saying, no, we always intended this to be biological sex. Anyway, you know that this is a minefield politically. And the thing that's also extraordinary here, and this is one of the reasons why I find it so hard to be a lawmaker, is I don't want the law to always be the definer of reality. I don't want to be dependent on the Supreme Court, the final arbiter of something which I know to be true. So, for example, if the Supreme Court had ruled another way, I mean, I would have been opposed to the Supreme Court. And I do think that we've got a little bit dependent on legal definitions in too many instances. But nonetheless, despite the fact that the Supreme Court has clarified, the institutions which have become so committed to gender ideology, which is what informs this muddle, have basically doubled down and said they're going to ignore the Supreme Court. So it's ironic because they're usually the people who rely on the law. And in this instance, they're actually in defiance of the law and are just saying, oh, no, well, we're going to ignore it and carry on the practice that we've been using up until now.
That's the thing which I think I find the most alarming and disturbing out of all of this process. And that is that there are, as you say, NGOs and Krangos and such like, who have said that they're not going to make any changes whatsoever with regard to the law. And surprisingly, I discovered that even the Houses of Parliament, or certainly the House of Commons, has ruled that they're going to allow transgender people to use female spaces. And it's expected that the House of Lords themselves will also make the same ruling, which puts them completely at odds, which puts the legislature at odds with the judiciary. Is that not a dangerous situation to be in?
Completely ridiculous, ludicrous scenario. One of the things which, of course, is the issue is that the House of Lords, the House of Commons, the whole of Whitehall, in fact, is dominated by the civil service. And so consequently, the lawmakers are over there, and then there's the civil servants, and of course, then there's just the staff. I mean, I'm not saying just the staff. I mean, there are then other degrees of staff as well. There's all sorts of forgive me, staff bodies, and they are you know, not necessarily being cooperative in relation to this. The civil service has been, the phrase is often used as well and truly captured, but it is true that, you know, that the civil service is, particularly the Whitehall civil service, has become completely enraptured, and this is largely because actually of another law, which is the equality law and its public sector duty has meant that many of the bodies, such as the civil service, have had to actively go about promoting the equality, diversity, and inclusion mantras of our day. They have brought in third parties to advise them or set up staff groups that get advice from third party organizations, which are often campaigning organizations. And we're all now familiar that Stonewall was the major lead in this, but there are others with different labels, but with the same intent, who have gone in and have basically advised these bodies on how they should have EDI-led workplaces. And it's become completely obsessional. I mean, there's been training courses that have been deeply embedded for many years. And so consequently, even when there's been decisions, well, we will no longer sign up for Stonewall this year, it doesn't make any difference because people have been on the training courses for years. And it's like an activist atmosphere. And so when I first arrived in the Lords, I mean, I've told this story before, but I think it sort of makes the point. I was something of a controversial, it was controversial when I was brought in. There'd been a huge amount of media backlash against me being awarded a peerage. And I felt very uncomfortable anyway, for the reasons we started off with. I was already intimidated without having, you know, all of the rest of the House of Lords kind of completely avoiding me like the plague and treating me in a particular way. And we had COVID, so there was a real plague around and everybody was therefore masked up. And so I never spoke to anyone for ages. And I thought one of the first pieces of legislation I thought I would speak on was on a maternity bill, because to be honest, I didn't want to discuss anything controversial. I was trying to kind of ease myself in gently by taking on a really kind of, you know, oh, this is a safe one. And I'd done some work on maternity leave before, so I felt very safe with it. Only to read the bill and discover that the word woman or mother was nowhere in it at all. And then I heard that in the Commons, a couple of people had raised this, and I felt obliged to raise it. And in fact, then that ended up being a small group of us who identified each other through this process. And so consequently, I found myself standing on the House of Lords saying, you know, people don't have vaginas, women have vaginas. I was thinking, what am I doing? You know, that sort of thing. But anyway, and of course, what had happened was that it was actually an active policy that the people who'd written the law had actively kept out the words woman and mother. Now, we eventually had a win. We got the word mother in, and that took a real fight. The word woman still didn't appear. They refused to have the word woman in the bill. Now, who was that? That wasn't the legislators who were doing that. That was behind the scenes. And so I think that what we've all realized much more in the last few years is that the creeping influence of transgender ideology, and I stress ideology rather than of people, has been a politicized, active, conscious attempt at taking over institutions. And it's worked.
I was going to say, it's been very successful.
Very.
Can I move on to another topic, which I know is you're very keen on, which is free speech itself and the status of free speech today. I know that Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, who's been making speeches, have claimed that free speech in the UK in particular is something which now concerns them. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, it's very difficult because, sorry, I don't know where I've got this cough from, but anyway, it's very difficult because J.D. Vance made a fantastic speech in Munich, which I thought really captured something when he came over and gave a lecture to the European elites, effectively, and said, you know, what are you for? He then drew attention to this real collapse of free speech in Europe, and I'm very, very worried about it. I agree with them. I'm slightly hesitant because obviously at the same time that he did that, JD Vance and Donald Trump have been launching what can only be described as something of a war against First Amendment rights in America. So, you know, it's very difficult because I don't want to let them off scotch-free just because they've spotted something here. I think that the UK has got itself into a complete tangle. And to just stress that one of the reasons why I'd ever encountered the transgender issue was via free speech. It wasn't something I was particularly following, but you know, a good 10, longer than that, 10 years ago, I wrote an article. Actually, it had nothing to do with me being ahead of the curve in terms of understanding trans issues, but that I was worried about the fact that in schools, there was trans activists going into schools and speaking, and I had columns in various educational publications, and the message of the trans activists in schools was, you can be whatever you want and don't take any notice of teachers telling you can't. And if you're in the wrong body or anything, but you asserting this, my article was saying how ludicrous it would be the end of education because I'm a former teacher. So I was making that point. I wasn't. Anyway, the people who I wrote the articles for, I wrote a couple of articles similarly to that, became very peculiar about it. One of them actually said, maybe the column's not working. And another sort of pointed out that possibly I'd gone too far and this would upset and offend people. So I first, anyway, you know, we now know that this was also going on, that in fact, you are not allowed to discuss certain issues. And I'm just pointing out that the reason I became alert to how serious the transgender ideology issue was that we were told there was no debate, no discussion allowed, even though in fact I wasn't writing some sort of militant anti-trans article at all. I was writing about education. And I think that that's one of the things that's really crept in, which is that there are certain topics that have just become ring-fenced away from criticism. We've got to a situation now where we know that if you go in one direction on particular issues, you will be demonized as some kind of a bigot. And this is sort of grown. I mean, there's increasing numbers of these issues. But I felt and feel that this is incredibly unhelpful in a democratic society. How on earth one can ever be in a situation where you dispute or debate which party you're going to vote for, what kind of political situation you want to be in, and so on and so forth. If you're not allowed to discuss certain issues, would seem to me to be entirely undermining of our whole system of democratic choice. I realized that in particular, the young were entirely unfamiliar with the notion that you could disagree, that they were being socialized into this world of imagining that that there was one opinion and that was it. That was the correct, virtuous opinion. And anyone who moved anywhere against it was somehow beyond the pale. And obviously we know that if we accept the notion that the opinions you have at 16 are the opinions that you will have when you're 60, this is the death of intellectual life, that we would just doing them a great disservice, that they would effectively be closing themselves off from ideas and the world of intellectual curiosity, of changing their mind is based on being open-minded, sufficiently open-minded to consider that maybe you had that wrong, to shift your viewpoint and so on. Let alone the fact that in order to be able to have that democratic world that I've just described, that you need to be familiar with understanding that you should listen to another argument. And even if you still believe what you thought at the beginning of the argument, in order to be efficiently able to defeat it in the public arena and to show other people, to persuade other people, you had to be used to arguing. You had to know what the weakness of their argument was, the strength of your own, and so on and so forth. Well, if you never hear any of those arguments, if you actually closet yourself away from them, which is effectively what free speech disputes have become, they haven't become just boring sort of no platforms. They are actually an active attempt at wrapping oneself in metaphorical cotton wool and saying, I refuse to listen to any argument that isn't the same as my own, that isn't considered to be on the right side of history as is described. And I demonize and delegitimize the other side, but I can't hear it. I can't even hear a word of it. And that's a very dangerous, potentially authoritarian position to have found ourselves in.
How much of this has come down from the top of, from government itself, from the idea that you demonize dissent across the board on many different things? I mean, did it ever strike you as almost impossible that we'd end up in a country whereby people who express contrary opinions will be labeled as producing misinformation or disinformation, or that people who are for tweets could even be criminalized, and often are criminalized for those kind of comments?
Well, the world of social media has contributed. I mean, I think it's overestimated how much people think it's contributed to this, but the one thing it has contributed to is a whole new arena that you can be censored in. I mean, the words misinformation and the fake news and that whole sort of idea of hate speech is largely because we've got this phenomenal new publishing tool, which is social media, which I mean, its democratic aspect is that it's open to everyone. And of course, that does mean that the people who run society suddenly become fearful about a kind of, Wild West, where the control of what you read and what you say is no longer held by gatekeepers in the same way. And so I think that has been one of the reasons why there has been something of a moral panic about what people are saying, hearing, reading.
But
And
did it ever
yeah,
does it surprise you that someone could end up in prison for 31 months just for an ill-judged tweet?
it's totally shocking. I mean, it's shocking because we've moved now from the demonization, calling you a bigot, to the law having become involved, and the law actually having been, I would say, misappropriated in very political ways in this fashion. And sorry, I became. I mean, I said about social media. I was just going to say about the online
Yeah,
safety bill or
yeah.
act as it is now. And I don't want to sound like, oh, as a legislator, but that's when you realise how these things happen. Because when that bill came before the House of Lords, first of all, there was hardly any of us who opposed it. There were certain devices that were used, which was to say, oh, this is about protecting children, and that essentially meant that lots of people in the House of Lords who were quite sympathetic to the free speech cause went stum because they didn't want anyone to think that they were being embroiled, that they were making any kind of an apology for, I know, child porn or grooming or any of these things. And so, and it was very difficult, but actually only 20% of the bill or the law affects children. And I was concerned about the adult section, but they used all of this stuff like, they used the language that I was familiar with from student union politics or from some of the radical left-wing identitarian world. Suddenly was going to be the law. So the definition of what was harmful, the definite was psychological harm, the subjective nature of who might complain, the fact that identity was very much brought in because identity politics, which was an expression of the disillusion of left-wing politics with the working class. It embraced this kind of rainbow notion that we were all just a collection of our immutable characteristics, our skin color, our sexuality, our sex, it's whatever. Suddenly has become part of the law, and they were determined that you were going to be protected. So via pieces of legislation like that, the law has now got to a point where it is used as a weapon against speech. And once that happens, the criminal law gets involved. And therefore, we can't be surprised, even though I am surprised and shocked, that the police have adopted this mores. By the way, the police officers have all been on these Stonewall-like courses as well, by the way. So and it's not just Stonewall. I mean, it's the whole edifice of equality, diversity, and inclusion. And they are all familiar. They're on the lookout for. And we know that this coincides with the coincidence of a perfect storm of the police almost having lost confidence in their core role of catching criminals and feel far happier criminalizing or policing newly criminalized speech because, you know, I mean, it's far preferable to going through Instagram to see what somebody has said incorrectly and then going around to arrest them than having to deal with some of the chronically awful problems of people just walking in and thieving from shops with impunity. But they're quite scary people. Or what do you do about knife crime? That's difficult. But going through Facebook and seeing whether a childminder said something in relation to the riots in the summer, easy peasy. And can you believe that childminder is in prison for 31 months when somebody who was actually a physical rioter, somebody who went out and attacked a mosque, for example, got a 28-month sentence, whereas somebody who wrote an unpleasant, undoubtedly did have a bit of bigotry in it, but very angry, furious, intemperate posting on Facebook would be sent to prison for that length of time. And now, by the way, be denied the right to have any early release, despite the fact that there is, a prison crisis where we're saying there's too many people in prison. The governments are letting people out who have possibly been sexual abusers or domestic abusers. They're getting out for early release. Lucy Connolly, the childminder, isn't because of her opinions.
I found one of the most shocking things I found was her appeal, which was dismissed, because you'd think that after a cooling off period, people would come back to their senses and think this is disproportionate. But I read Lord Justice Holroyd, who was the lead judge in the appeal, who dismissed the appeal, said there is no arguable basis on which it could be said that the sentence imposed by the judge was manifestly excessive. I thought most people in the country would have thought it was manifestly excessive.
But this is because actually the legal situation in relation to speech is very serious if you get caught. And she was advised to plead guilty, ill-advised, in many might say. And we know that people pleaded guilty because they believed that they would get lesser sentences, maybe not get sentences at all. And kind of just wanted to go home. But anyway, the Court of Appeal claim that there's very little they can do in those circumstances. But I thought the fact that Justice Holroyd didn't even concede why this might be controversial. I mean, even if he said, well, within the very narrow premises of this appeal in relation to this particular treatment of this particular woman, but we can understand what the concerns are. But, oh no, nothing. And, incitement is a serious crime. Now, one of the things that we've got a problem with, which is when we hear the term incitement, we think, understandably, that incitement is where you directly try and stir people up to go out and do something. And it's very tightly drawn in the law. I mean, you're not allowed to just... and it seems to me that the interpretation of incitement in this instance, because she pleaded guilty, means that despite the fact it was obviously not an incitement, it was understood to be an incitement because she pleaded guilty to it being an incitement. But the term incitement is now used all the time. You are inciting someone. If you have a very strong opinion and you share it, you're accused of inciting. But then there's inciting action. Lucy Connolly was convicted on inciting hatred. Now that's kind of one step removed. Now, inciting hatred is one of those subjective terms as well, because we all think we know what we mean by hatred. This is going to be somebody who is a really vile person, but actually even hatred is a subjective term. What do you mean? Who do you mean by hate? And by the way, I legitimately hate lots of things, right? And so we can't criminalize it. It's very scary.
Yeah. Where then is the balance between freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and the sensitivities of society? How do you draw the line between them? Are you a free speech absolutist? You can say what you like, or is there drawing a line somewhere?
So I'm called a free speech absolutist, and I think with good reason, because I think it's very difficult to draw the line. I actually do think there should be a law on incitement, by the way,
Yeah.
but very tightly drawn. I do think there are circumstances that I can imagine that you would have some kind of regulatory or legal intervention into speech. But I'm very anxious. I would largely repeal most speech laws. Get rid of them. Just kick them out. Now, that does not mean that you can speak without any sanction, but I think that sanction should be social and cultural. I
Right.
mean,
Not.
I would like there to be a much greater criticism, a public outcry when people tell lies. But I think that, for example, libel law is often used to silence, is used by the powerful to silence criticism. The libel law is very broadly drawn in this country. It's called the libel capital of the world for good reason. So you could have a very minimal libel law, but even in relation to what you asked originally, which was about misinformation, I mean, very often the term misinformation, disinformation is used simply to delegitimize difficult views. I mean, it's been used politically. It was used during the lockdown period successfully to silence and debate on legitimate debate, in my opinion, about, for example, the efficacy of mandated vaccines, of the origins of the COVID in the first place, the Wuhan lab leak, and it was open. We now know that it was openly discussed as we do not want people to know that this was a lab leak from China because it would cause social problems. That's the active intervention of the state talking to big tech companies and telling them to label things. I mean, and the everything from and that happened in America, but it came over here. And even, as it were, the Hunter Biden laptop story. But I mean, we were told anyone who argued about the Hunter Biden laptop, if people know what that is, but anyway, regardless, newspapers were told that they were peddling Russian misinformation. Years later, they've admitted, oh, there was a Hunter Biden laptop, there was a scandal, and we hushed it up by labeling anyone who raised it as peddling misinformation. And partly this emerged during the Brexit period, which was misinformation. The familiarity of the term misinformation was that the reason why people voted to leave the European Union was because they were all idiots who had just fallen for misinformation, which was being put out by, actually, again, Russian bots. And it's insulting to those who make political decisions, that it's assumed that you've fallen for these lies. However, I don't want to be complacent about the genuine problem in a social media era of information that isn't accurate. And I don't want us to be in a situation where we don't challenge it. I just don't trust the official fact checkers. I don't trust BBC Verify because it's one-sided and biased. We were told by Mark Zuckerberg that the Meta Facebook fact checkers were politically biased against certain issues, and that they, for example, were not prepared to indulge anyone who made anything like what's known as a gender critical comment. So if you asserted that it was misinformation to say that a transgender woman wasn't actually a man who identifies as a woman, that actually is misinformation. That is actually accurate, but that was labeled misinformation, hate speech, and so on. So, but how do we deal with the fact that after the terrible events in Liverpool the other evening, when the car ran into the Liverpool football fans, there was quite a lot of people spouting rubbish, right, and speculating. I mean, there's nothing wrong with speculating, but then asserting as fact things that were not factually true. Now, I don't think that content should be taken down. I don't think the people who are putting it forward should be criminalized. But I do want there to be a public square in which more and more of us say that's rubbish, that's not true. And so we've lost our belief in our own capacity to police each other's views, to historically, what you would do is, people who were constantly bigoted would be sent to Coventry. I mean, the phrase being that you would be kind of like socially kept out of circumstances until you kind of, thought about what you were saying. But we also were much more frank with each other and just would say, this is rubbish.
Yeah.
What now has happened is that our instinct is to report to the authorities somebody we believe to be sharing a mistruth.
The authorities, of course, have encouraged that kind of reporting, though.
Absolutely. It's like snitch culture, isn't it?
Yeah. Before we move on from free speech, let me give you one more hard case, which is coming up in the courts shortly. Should burning the Quran in public be against the law?
Absolutely not.
Absolutely
I
not.
do not. It's not an activity I advocate, but it should not be. Burning the Quran or burning the Bible or burning anything. Freedom of religion. I'm a very big supporter of religious freedom, so I defend religious practice and religious mores, even though I'm not religious, to happen in a secular society. It's a crucial bedrock of a modern tolerant society. But freedom of religion also has to live alongside freedom to ridicule and critique religion, because those freedoms are not contradictory at all. They're actually dependent on each other. If you have freedom to simply to mock religion, but you deny people the right to religious freedom, then obviously you're in danger then of being prejudiced against people with religious beliefs. If you have just freedom of religion and say, I can't have anything that offends it, then you are effectively bringing in a blasphemy law where you're talking about a denial of the secular freedom to say that religion is rubbish. And so you're constantly negotiating this. But the person who it's a really big case that's coming up.
Hamid Kozkun is apparently set fire to the Quran outside the Turkish consulate. And he shouted, Islam is a religion of terrorism. And he's now going to appear at Westminster Magistrates Court, charged with disorderly behaviour likely to cause harassment, alarm, or distress.
So that term harassment and that term distress, they are now regularly used in the law. Now, harassment that's another one of those words. You think if somebody says, I'm being harassed, that you imagine being stalked and, this intense sort of harassment is now speech, regularly used as speech and hurt feelings. Workplace harassment, which we're discussing in the laws at the moment, is that very broad definition. That means that they want to protect you from harassment and they're effectively imposing speech codes on workplaces. Anyway, to go back to your case, it is going to be incredibly dangerous if this person is sent to prison, particularly because we know that there are huge sensitivities in relation to the particular religion of Islam, because we have had this very difficult situation over recent years, which is that we've had the rise of Islamism. And Islamism is a politicized version of the religion. So it uses all the language of the religion. And so it's difficult, as I've just said. I support freedom of religion, and it's understandable that some people now associate Islam, the religion, with Islamist terrorism, with extreme form of religious practice that that in one interpretation could be seen to be completely anti-women, anti-gay, and so on and so forth, right? So, there's kind of views, but that also in practice can often mean a kind of segregated society in many of the cities in the UK, many towns in the UK. And so people have got into a muddle over it. And there's an attempt by some parliamentarians to bring in a formal definition. The government are going along with this, of Islamophobia. Well, this will have a terrible chilling effect, because we know that in relation to the horrors of the grooming gangs in northern cities and towns, that one of the reasons why people did not report the mass sexual assaults and rape of young girls in those towns was because the perpetrators were largely Pakistani Muslims, and they were frightened that they'd be accused of Islamophobia. And so we're constantly negotiating these things. So always, in my view, we should bend the stick towards as much speech as possible. And then we can untangle the difficulties that we encounter around what a word means. You know, what do you mean by Islamism? What do you mean by... And there are people who are constantly expressing just downright anti-Muslim views, right? Social media is full of it. It's only through having the conversation where when you get to the root of it, they'll say, well, it's just that aren't Muslims all signed up to supporting, you know, terrorism against the West? And you can explain, no, that's not true. You know, are all Muslims going along with the rape gangs in Blackburn and so on and so forth? And you say, no, that's not true. But, you know, you've got to thrash these things out. I think freedom isn't an easy... You're living in a free society is not easy. You know, if you go to an authoritarian country, or you go to somewhere, you know, you go to somewhere like China or whatever. I mean, in some ways, it's kind of straightforward because you're just not allowed to say certain things, you know, and the authoritarian mindset or those regimes is to say, we don't want you to worry about this. We'll take care of all this. You just keep within the parameters, and we'll look after you. You know, as a kind of paternalism, even though it's kind of got a very nasty side to it. But it is difficult because, you know, in some ways it's so, you know, in a way lockdown was so easy. It was terrible, but it was so easy because there were kind of rules, you know, don't leave the house, don't do this, don't do that. And we were infantilized, but it kind of took away all those difficult choices that you have as an adult, which is, well, I don't know what to do. Now we were being told.
The worrying thing that I find was that a lot of people seem to prefer that to normal life and wanted to go back to it.
I agree. I
Yeah.
agree.
Yeah. Let me ask you another, which moves on slightly, but there's an increasingly common comment these days that we live in now a two-tier justice system. It's operating de facto that, you know, if you're on one side of a political fence, you get treated harshly, and if you're on a different side, you get forgotten about and people don't worry about it. What's your view of that? Is there a two-tier system, or is that exaggerated?
Well, it's interesting because until relatively recently, the government under Keir Starmer had more or less labelled anyone who commented on two-tier justice in any way as being effectively spouting far-right propaganda or being far-right adjacent. However, recently, interestingly, the Justice Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, admitted that used the term two-tier justice when referring to new sentencing guidelines, which she condemned.
No.
And that's because it was discovered that the Sentencing Council were advocating that pre-sentencing reports should basically be awarded to people from different ethnic minorities and community minorities, as it happens, also trans groups as well, trans individuals as well. And these pre-sentencing reports are very important because it basically is the way that the judiciary can take the sentencing guidelines and effectively say these people are people we shouldn't put in prison. You know, it's a way that you would often not be imprisoned. You would be found guilty, but the pre-sentencing reports would keep you away from being incarcerated. Anyway, Shabana Mahmood, the Justice Secretary, not me, came out and said, this is terrible. This is not equality in front of the law. And of course, because she's Shabana Mahmood and she herself is a woman of colour and a Muslim, when she said two-tier justice, it was kind of like quite, you know, she had immunity. And also, I think it was a real admission, genuinely, of how far these things have gone. The Sentencing Council, of course, you know, absolutely doubled down and refused to acknowledge this. And it's now been clarified, temporarily at least, those sentencing guidelines have been torn up. But I think we'll see that come back again. There is two-tier approach to these things. I mean, on the one hand, the problem with identity politics is that it gives a special status to various people as in need of protection, as I've said. So, you know, women need protection, people from ethnic minorities need protection, and so on and so forth. it creates an ever widening group of people who want to claim that their particular victim status needs protection, because through that protection you can gain special rights, you can gain certain advantages, and actually it's not just protection, but you start to be able to have something you can demand. So you say, I demand, as a Muslim woman, I demand that you do this, and society is sort of anxious about saying no to you, and so there's an ever-growing number of people in that category. And of course, the people who find it difficult to fit into that category are, you know, in the caricatured sense, white males. You know, white males are in serious difficulty because they don't really fall into the victim category. Now, one of the dangers is that there's become a political discourse that then tries to say the white working class are victims too, trying to somehow squeeze the white working class in. But I think that genuinely there are different approaches that are used, and I think this is undoubtedly, everybody can see it in their eyes, right? That the police who've all been on these EDI courses are absolutely jolly and happy to go along to a trans inclusive pride demo and kind of dance along to the music and be part and parcel rather than police it, and to turn a blind eye if anything goes wrong. And yet, you know, when people go on demonstrations against immigration, for example, or against lockdown, or, you know, there's endless examples, they're much more, they suddenly return to being the police officers that we've kind of become familiar with. We've seen it in relation to the Palestine-Israel conflict.
Yeah.
People are just tearing their hair out. They cannot understand how somebody can be put in prison for 31 months for that Facebook post, but on regular outings of the pro-Palestinian demonstrators. And by the way, I don't want them all to be sent to prison. I'm making the point about double standards, that you can go out and call for, you know, jihad, call for internationalize the Intifada, and so on and so forth. Say things that are arguably have placards that are distinctly anti-Semitic, and so on and so forth. And the police say, well, it's their right to free expression. You know, it's their right to demonstrate. Now, I think that's right. I don't want them all loading into police vans. But the problem is that they don't have a consistency in the way what they consider to be hate speech or misbehavior. And so it's become a genuine problem, because I think that now what we have is a situation where, for the first time historically in the modern era, the vast majority of people who live in this country don't trust the police or the justice system to be fair.
Yes, that's
I mean,
quite
that's a
different
terrible thing to have
from
happened.
when I was a child. It's quite a different situation entirely. What one particular person who has been labelled as being treated in a two-tier kind of system and has come to the prominence recently is Tommy Robinson, who was released from prison only yesterday. What's your view of him?
I'm not a fan, to say the least, and I do think that he should have been in prison, because he wasn't put in prison for a speech crime. This is slightly different. You know, he blatantly went along with defying the law. I mean, even, you know, I don't think you should do that. And he also was repeating, I mean, you know, very egregiously, something which was proven to be untrue, and it's a complicated case. However, I'm not a great fan of Tommy Robinson's shtick, understatement of the year, but I also think that, you know, I've kind of followed him on social media, and I think that he very often is somebody who you know, comes out with bile and bigotry, and but that doesn't mean that I think he should be punished by the law for that. However, where I think there was two-tier justice, just as an aside, is I do think that probably the way he's been treated in prison has been ridiculous. And you know, he's been the irony here is he's basically been turned into some kind of free speech martyr who's been treated as a political prisoner because the state didn't know how to deal with him. I mean, my view is that he should have been put in prison. And they put him into some sort, they put him into very high, strong category B prison. I've no idea why, for the crime that he committed. Should have been in more open prison, category C or what have you. He should have, and because he wasn't in category B prison, where they hold, by the way, the people who are explicitly in prison for Islamist terrorist offences. What? Why would you do that? Put him in a different prison. Put him in a softer prison. Then they had to put him into solitary confinement for the whole time he was in prison for his own protection. Which actually, if you want his own protection, put him in a different prison. And, if he gets into fights with people, let him get into fights with people. Then he can be punished if he gets into fights and it's his fault, or he can be protected if he needs it. But the whole way that he's been treated has given him a certain amount of, the kind of publicity that you can't buy. So it's been very unpleasant for him. And I do not think that he should have been treated like that. And that has created this sort of, again, it creates this atmosphere that if you're the wrong kind of prisoner, that you're treated in a particular way. Now, it's not as though we haven't seen a clampdown now on people like Just Stop Oil protesters, for example, who have, by the way, broken the law in such a way. I mean, I don't just mean the law is always the case, but they have, I would argue, gone so far as to potentially they should be in prison, even though you can say it's right to protest, because they've actually gone around disrupting the life of society in such a way. That's an argument that we can have. But they just go to prison, right? And they try and make out the political business. But I think that they have, none of them, been treated in the way that Tommy Robinson was. So whilst I'm not a Tommy Robinson fan, I think to have given him this sort of special status that the state has because he's the wrong one, from their point of view, he embodies and epitomizes this idea of sort of working class rebellion, even though in fact I think he's a charlatan and it's not reflective of the mass uprising of working class populism that we're seeing. But nonetheless, he represents the kind of disdain with which the state treats certain types of people. We've in fact created more of a monster than we have dealt with it, and it has been two-tier in that sense.
Yeah. Moving on, coming roughly towards the end of our time, but I did want to talk to you about one of the problems which I think the electorate sees as a main problem, which is immigration. People say that the Reform Party has been really boosted by in the local elections recently because of this particular issue being very prominent. Do you see immigration as a problem? And if so, how would you solve it?
Yes, I think that it has become the problem because of the way it's been mismanaged over the years. So I'm not opposed to immigration per se. And in fact, I was, until relatively recently, I would have considered myself to be fairly liberal about immigration. And I'm certainly not frightened of immigrants in a kind of any kind of xenophobic way, or I mean, historically, I don't think they're a kind of corrupting influence in any way whatsoever. But I'm afraid that this issue has become a lightning rod because it epitomizes people's feeling that they have no control over the society they live in. And in a democracy, that's a really dangerous situation to be in, that you feel as though things are being done to you and that you're not, equal before the law, that your vote at the ballot box is just treated with disdain. Because immigration has been something which politicians have promised to tackle on the one hand, and then behind the backs of the electorate have not tackled it. The nature of contemporary immigration, I mean, first of all, that was one of the causes for concern in relation to Brexit, that people felt that freedom of movement, which nobody in the UK could ever have any say over because it was an EU decision, meant that the country, in terms of its population, could never be controlled. So there was that side to it. In terms of immigration, obviously we have illegal immigration in terms of the small boats. and that's a security issue for a lot of people. It's the brazen flouting of the law. We've just talked about people being locked up for 31 months, but if you kind of break the law by arriving on a small boat and you haven't got any documentation, you're treated by huge sections of the ruling elite as though you're victims or heroes for being brave enough to get into the boats. And you're put into hotels, you're not put into prison, right? So people just think, what, etc., etc. And so that's a real problem, and it's also caused huge amount of social tension, because you've got a situation whereby in many small towns there are huge groups of people, undocumented, nobody knows who they are, as it were, often very young men who are living in the midst of local towns, and they're not integrated in any way, and they've got no status, and people are a bit, thrown by this, and let alone the impact on services. And then you've got mass migration in a situation where people feel that resources are very, very scarce and under pressure. And that mass migration was largely behind the backs of the electorate in the Boris wave and so on. But it's because it's been smoke and mirrors all the way. So it's one thing saying, oh, great, we'll have overseas students, but then you find out that all their families and their dependents have been able to come. So it's not quite the same as when I was at university, it was overseas students, right? It's like suddenly what? And then you say, oh, well, we'll have this group of people come. And again, it's like family dependence. Things are constantly argued for through human rights legislation, as we know. People will say, are you saying that people should have no right to have their families with them? And of course you think, no, well, I'm not saying that. But then you are, then you're thinking, oh, but did I really mean 35 people associated with this one individual? Anyway, the point was nobody asked us. And so this has been happening. So nobody asked. We didn't know. And so you can understand it. Sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. I was just going to say, what you mentioned the fact that successive governments have promised to deal with this particular issue. The Conservative government had 14 years where each time they were elected, they promised that they would solve the problem, all the way back to David Cameron. And even Keir Starmer, when he was elected, said he would solve the problem, but there is no solution presented. Is there a reason for that? Is it because they don't really want to solve it, or is it because they are powerless to do so? What's really going on there?
I think it's a combination of two things. I mean, we've kind of almost sanctified the immigrant. I mean, in the House of Lords, whenever this issue comes up, and actually the bishops all suddenly stand up, and they basically talk about immigrants and asylum seekers as though they're somehow sort of like the holy ones. I mean, it's a kind of ludicrous situation. And anyone and the people who they then say are the problem are anyone who doesn't understand that these are the suffering. So they've become a kind of metaphor for suffering everywhere, and we're all supposed to embrace them. So that, and there's also this notion of the kind of the good immigrant, and the kind of I know that happens alongside an increasing contempt for ordinary people who live in this country, our own fellow citizens, right? I mean, because they sneer, it's kind of like, oh God, all those football types, or although, it's like that's a kind of, they're not part and parcel. So it's a kind of EDIification of the immigrant that has led there to be this romanticized version of what immigration means. But it's also the case that there is, partly used as an excuse, but partly true, that the way that rule has happened, the way that law has been organized over the last several decades, is through international law. And international law and international agreements suits the ruling elites because it's a way for them to ring fence off decisions from any popular discussion. So they can say, well, it's because we've signed on to the Convention on Human Rights, but there's a variety of conventions that we're not allowed to do that. And so they're constantly hiding behind the law as though it's a sort of tablets of stone. And therefore, you can't discuss it. It doesn't matter what you say, that can't happen. But I think that one of the things that I'm getting wrong in this discussion is that somehow I'm focusing my angst, or my fury or frustration in relation to the immigrants, or not the immigrants, but immigration in themselves. Whereas one of the things that's happened is the immigration in the past was immigration into a country that knew who it was, that knew what it was, that had a sense of what being British meant. And when you arrived as an immigrant, you didn't have to sign on some dotted line, I am loyal to the British way of life. But there was something palpable that you were participating in. And I'm from an Irish, background. My parents came over and they were not particularly pro-British, but they're escaping poverty in Ireland. They literally fled the people after them for money. And my whole upbringing, and there was lots of people where I lived who were from different countries, was, to be respectful of the society that we lived in, right? Not sycophantic, but respectful. I mean, I went on to be a revolutionary communist who wanted to smash the state. So I'm not suggesting that you kind of went along and signed a dotted line of kind of compliance. But on the other hand, I did understand what the UK represented. That was part of the deal. Now we're in a situation whereby at home, the people who run society, the people in charge of inculcating that sense of what it means to be Britain, hate Britain. I mean, every institution that, for example, represents history wants to trash British history.
Yeah.
The kind of embarrassment, a self-loathing. And so consequently, and we've talked about EDI, there's a dismantling of the institutions that made up the United Kingdom. There's an undermining of any kind of universal sense of what it means to live in this society. So what is now happening is we have mass migration at a time like that. We have mass migration at a time in which we can't say integrate into a British way of life because we don't like a British way of life. And actually, it's become a British way of life to go along with identitarian segregation and to accommodate to the wishes of anyone with an identity who can demand anything. A kind of multiculturalism, which is a policy rather than multi-ethnic society, which is a reality of which I am happy with. Multiculturalism is an active top-down policy that divides people into different cultures and then demands that we should respect those cultures regardless and give up any sense of judgment at all. And so it's a complete mess.
Yeah. Well, my last quick question, if I may, because we've run out of time now. But my last question to you is this, Claire, and that is, if you could wave a magic wand of some kind. I mean, you're a legislature, a part of the legislature now. If you could pass one law or repeal one law, what would it be?
Actually, I would pass a bill that would demand that we looked at trying to repeal legislation. In other words, I think we should repeal lots and lots and lots of laws. So we shouldn't pass a bill to do that. But what we should do is we should have a commission or something like that, in which we say, right, we're going to put forward the repeal of 100 laws. Because there are so many laws. I mean, every time you look, there's a law. They keep bringing in laws all the time, and most of them could be ripped up. I would obviously repeal all of the speech laws.
What people forget is that every time you introduce a new law, you restrict some freedom somewhere or other, because that's what law does. There was I forget who the name of the king was, but back in Babylonian times, I think they had a system whereby if you created a new law, you had to repeal an old law. So there was a constant number of them.
Very good.
That's
a good idea. I might suggest it, but it is absolutely the case that I'm something of an obsessive vapor, having been an obsessive smoker, as you might, my cough earlier would have indicated. But I gave up smoking some time ago. Anyway, they're bringing in a law to ban disposable vapes on Sunday.
Yeah.
And the reason I'm saying that is because at some point along the line, if you don't comply, you can be sent to prison for 2 years if you sell disposable vapes. It's like, of all the priorities, and also in order to enforce this stupid law, which is stupid, by the way, because it's been brought in by DEFRA, and vaping has been one of the fantastic innovations of smoking cessation, is help people like me, chain smokers, to give up smoking. Well, they brought it in because of litter or something. Anyway, but there's a whole bill, there's a whole law, there's a whole thing, and there's going to be another bill coming in on smoking, on tobacco and vaping to make it even. They're going to get rid of flavored vapes. Anyway, I won't bore you, but the apparatus that's required to police these new bills. Also, we wonder why the police aren't doing a good job. They're constantly being asked to do stupid things, to police ridiculous things. And I cannot emphasize enough that we make too many laws and we criminalize too many actions.
On that positive note that we could get rid of most laws. Thank you very much indeed for your time and for a very interesting conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.